Thank you, Ori. You know you've been to a good conference when you leave with more questions and philosophical queries than with which you actually began. For my part, at least, I feel I learned a lot this last couple of days, and I would very much like to thank Laura and the Department of Philosophy for their warm hospitality. Most of the papers that we've heard these days are quite advanced in the sense that they seem to presuppose quite a lot so as to build on it a sharp, developed argument. I'm going to work the other way. I'm going to focus on some of the background assumptions that we make at the current state of our debates in the philosophy of emotions. The main reason is that I find not as obvious many of the assumptions that we currently take into our research in this discipline. So, I'm just going to read, so I apologize for that. A sad mood can affect our way of thinking by slowing down our reasoning process, making us pay more attention to detail. Elation appears to have the opposite result, allowing an abundance of information to flow through our senses, painting a multicolored picture of our social environment with a broad brush. Moods, therefore, are affects which appear to affect how we reason. However, that's not the topic I will explore tonight. Moods are also set the stage for a variety of human activities, enabling and facilitating or obstructing and undermining our projects. Moods have thus a direct effect on the realization of our intentions, setting limits on the potency of practical reason. However, that is neither the issue we'll address tonight. What I'm interested in is the rather more basic question as to whether moods themselves can be rational. In particular, I would like to consider why the question about the rationality of moods is one that is rarely, if ever, posed. Books and articles on the rationality or the fittingness or the appropriateness of emotions are currently an important part of the philosophical literature. Why is there no such corresponding interest in the rationality of moods? Answering that question is a complex matter whose unfolding might have to take into account not only theoretical but also some cultural considerations pertaining to the formation of the philosophy of emotions as a distinct discipline in academia over the last couple of decades. Nevertheless, my own concern is not with the cultural, historical, but with the conceptual question of what it is about mood as a specific type of affect that makes it not easily amenable to standard models of rationality. We may think of that issue through an analogy with other mental types. Doxastic states are or should be grounded on epistemic reasons. Desiderative states are or should be grounded on normative, prudential, or moral reasons. Are mood states in their turn grounded on some kind of epistemic or normative or even sui generis moody reasons? The fact that this kind of question is not often discussed makes me think that the default answer to it is no. Moods are not grounded on reasons. And my hypothesis to why that counts as the default answer is that most philosophers of emotion, despite their many and sharp disagreements, share a basic line of reasoning. The rationality of an affective state is somehow dependent upon how that state is related to its intentional object. But given that moods do not seem to bear an intentional relation to any object, it is hard to see how they can be in the offing for rational assessment. My focus tonight is on just one of the premises of that line of reasoning, namely that moods do not seem to be intentional states. As I'll explore that premise in the context of the current debate over the representational content of affectivity, and will conclude with some remarks about the intelligibility of mood phenomena. So, let's start. Human beings are naturally attracted to change. Moods, as enduring occurrences of feeling, appear resistant to change. They thus go against the basic tenet of emotive experience. It's following closely upon, rising after, attending to or subsiding with alterations in one's environment. The apparent stability of moods might not be confused for absence of psychological activity. In a depressive mood, there might be disquiet. In an elated mood, excitation. However, being in a mood is a phenomenon often taken to present a challenge to the understanding of affective states as attuned to what unfolds in the outside world. In the case of moods, the problem of producing a unified account of affective intentionality is accentuated due to a tension between two seemingly innocuous facts. On the one hand, it is evident that the mood experienced by a subject is not unrelated to how the world appears to her. On the other hand, it is not obvious in what sense a mood might be taken to be of or about anything or as directed at some object. What seems hard to comprehend is how, during mood experience, the inner meets the outer. And its solution to this problem comes under the heading of representationalism, according to which the phenomenal aspects of a mood are exhausted by its representational content. Representationalism is, as we all know, a general thesis about the phenomenal character of conscious experience. A representationalist about moods may assert that, as in the case of the phenomenology of seeing blue, there is nothing more to the experience than the representation of something as blue. So in the case of a depressive mood, there is nothing more to the phenomenology of the experience than the representation of one's environment as devoid of prospects or significance. As a way of exploring that issue, let me first make some general remarks which in my view should inform our discussion of moods. Keeping in mind those remarks may facilitate our inquiry into the relevant phenomena, and it will also help us assess the plausibility of the premises which inform my analysis. A theory of moods should first of all respect their distinctiveness as a type of affective experience. As affective experiences, moods have a phenomenal aspect that is primarily open to the first-person standpoint. The agent's own access to her mood is in that sense privileged. However, that fact does not preclude the significance of third-person research. On the contrary, some aspects of mood may be best interpreted by attendant observers or engaged interlocutors. When it comes to one's knowledge of one's own affective experience, privilege does not mean exclusive. Correspondingly, it is worth stressing the significance of the standpoint from which the discourse on mood is articulated. An emotion typically directs one's attention to the world outside oneself. Consequently, the agent's narration of her emotional state can employ the subject-object dichotomies, which pertain, for instance, to the description of perceptual experience. In its turn, that type of discourse facilitates a sense of distance from one's own emotive experience, which may increase the reliability of the subject's own report. In the case of moods, the epistemic situation of the agent is quite different. Mood is experienced as apparently both all-encompassing and irrevocably intimate. As all-encompassing, mood seems to leave nothing out of its purview, thus rendering difficult the process of telling what is from what is not directly relevant to the arising of that state. As irrevocably intimate, mood requires special effort to detach oneself from its grip. Hence, from a first-person standpoint, an impartial description of mood's characteristics is often hard to achieve. Accordingly, our approach should strike a balance between the phenomenological starkness of third-person observations and the narrative partiality of first-person descriptions. No less significant is to attend to the distinct character of mood experience. The methodological problem here is twofold. One is to brush over any difference between mood and emotions, recasting the former as a type of the latter. Such an approach ends up treating emotion as the sole occupant of a homogeneous affective landscape. And here, Nico Freida, Jesse Prince in Conversation, and many others eventually follow that route. The other is to conceive of moods as constitutionally different from emotions, located at a different region of the mental domain, and deprived of the characteristics which give emotional experience its meaningfulness. That approach leads to what I would call a hybrid theory of affectivity, which reserves exclusively higher-level features for emotion, such as intelligence, conceptuality, rationality, and leaves more primitive characteristics for moods as causally overdetermined, non-conceptual reflex phenomena. And the interesting thing is that Paul Griffiths and Nussbaum totally converge on that. So we have two philosophers at the two extremes of the current debate, treating moods as totally different from emotional occurrences. A related point concerns the debate over the intentionality of moods. Granted that emotions are intentional states, and on the assumption that affectivity is not some disjoint, irregular domain, it is inferred that moods, as part of that domain, share with the motive states one of their essential characteristics, namely their intentionality. The inference might be reasonable, but its ground is not stable. Ideally, we would want our theory of mood phenomena to arise out of an exploration of the phenomena themselves. What we're offered instead is a claim driven by a wish for theoretical completeness. It might be best, therefore, to approach the issue of intentionality of moods as a distinct kind of mental phenomena through a different route. During affective experience, even when everything appears meaningless, the affect itself is not a meaningless occurrence. Every mood, be it positive or negative, or even neutral, appears to have some significance. I would suggest that the significance of mood is double-arrowed. A mood indicates something for the life of the person undergoing the experience, while it points at a value-laden aspect of the surrounding world. That pointing at of intentionality, and its invocation has explanatory power because it helps to render the whole experience intelligible. Citing the general peril that a person encounters helps us to make sense of his mood of anxiety. Invoking the offensiveness of the world he inhabits renders intelligible his irritable mood. By correlating the experience with the salient effects of a situation, the intentionality of moods appears to enable our understanding why the person is in the mood that he is. However, if that is the main reason why the notion of intentionality plays an important role in a theory of moods, then certain desiderata arise about the type of intentionality under consideration. On the one hand, it should be a type of relation whose invocation explains by justifying. An appeal to the intentional correlation between a situation of general peril and the mood of anxiety offers a rationalizing explanation. On the other hand, the intentionality of moods should refer to items which are in principle able to affect the person who is in a mood. If we were to try to correlate a mood with an item that is impossible by its very constitution to affect anyone or anything, then we would fail to provide an explanation. Hence, the alleged intentional relation between the mood and that item would not render the mood intelligible, not to mention rational. The above desiderata leave room for a variety of theories about the intentionality of moods, yet they are far from trivial since they set limits on the kind of items that can be intentionally correlated to a mood. One of the things we desire of our theory of moods is that it make good metaphysical sense. Assuming that our metaphysics is broadly naturalistic, it would be good if we could locate moods in the natural order of things. Moods involve several characteristics, most prominent of which is their phenomenality, the way it feels to the subject of experience to be in a mood. The representationalist asserts that the phenomenal aspects of a mental state are either identical to or depend upon parts of the representational content. Given that the naturalistic account of how objects get mentally represented is already here or soon forthcoming, we have a way for accommodating in principle the phenomenal through the representational within a naturalistic ontology. Notice that the starting point of the representationalist analysis is not some question that arises while exploring the relevant affective experience, but the issue of applicability of a ready-made theory to the case of moods. Methodologically, that is a cause for concern. The concern is exacerbated if we reflect on one of the major considerations that drive representationalism about the mental. It is a widely accepted fact that an attempt to focus on the phenomenal qualities of certain experiences, on what it is like to see something as a white, rectangular, smooth surface, will eventually take you to attend to the properties of the piece of paper you're observing. The attempt to switch attention from external objects and properties perceived to the visual experience you're having is almost certainly doomed to frustration. Representationalists claim that the best explanation of the fact that one's attention goes through the perceptual experience to items of the external world is that the phenomenal properties of the experience consist in its representational properties. Whatever phenomenal content a visual experience enjoys, it is reducible to its representational content. I do not wish to dispute this line of reasoning. What is often missed, though, is that representationalism about visual experience functions as the default option because it is rightly considered to be in tune with naive realism. Representationalism about visual experience, in other words, is in tune with the folk psychology of ordinary experience. But that is hardly the case with moods. Folk psychology treats moods as a deeply personal affair, and common sense expects that in inquiring about one's moods, one turns one's mental eye inwards. Accordingly, a critic of representationalism may argue that when someone tries to focus on his mood state, his attention doesn't go out to the world. On the contrary, he tries to focus on the world. If he tries to focus on the world, he often ends up focusing only on his own state. That's actually the view of Julien Deona and several others. The critic may also claim that in attending to my experience of some mood, I focus directly on what it feels like to be in that mood. He may go further in maintaining that focusing inwards may suffice for a proper understanding of the mood experience. Although I share the critic's concerns, I would not subscribe to the last claim. As I argued earlier, an affective experience is not easily detachable from the world within which a person undergoes that experience. Banning from view the salient features of his situation might make a person's experience very hard to comprehend. It may render it unintelligible. Let us then look carefully at the models of intentionality upheld by the representationalists. The standard way to represent intentionality of a mental state is by citing the object at which it is directed. The first candidate for an intentional object that is attributed to moods is the whole world. That's Bob Solomon, Lyons, Annette Bayer, and several others. That proposal appears to do justice to the overwhelming character of many moods, the fact that moods pervade our experience, that they suffuse all aspects of our encounter with reality. However, taken literally, the suggestion that the world is the intentional object of our moods is, in my view, problematic for three reasons. First, the proposal employs a notion that is not easy to determine. It is not clear whether we're invited to think of the world as a maximally inclusive situation encompassing all others, like David Lewis does, or perhaps as an object which has in it everything except for itself, that's Russell, or as the totality of phenomena linked by a complex network of references to each other, that's basically Heidegger. It can be retorted that the proposal requires nothing more than a loose understanding of that term, as employed in ordinary contexts. However, that retort does not really answer our query. It rather shows that the appeal of the proposal trades on the ambiguity of the basic term it employs. Second problem. The proposal makes excessive demands on the representational capacities of ordinary subjects. An affective state that is intentionally correlated to the whole world would entail an ability to form representations that moves well beyond the perspectival, partial, and limited access to one's environment. Finally, even if we manage to sort out the above issues, the suggestion that moods are intentionally directed at the whole world founders on the problem of distinguishability between kinds of affective states. To be outraged with the whole world is not a mood, it is a very intense emotion. Second proposal. The second proposal treats the generality of the intentional object in a distributive manner. Instead of setting one object, the whole world, as the intentional correlate of mood, it takes as object the members of a disjunctively defined set composed of anything that comes our way. This is actually Goldie's phrase. De Souza uses also a lot in his talks. For any object encountered, we have, during a mood experience, a corresponding intentional relation. That proposal has the advantage of offering a way of distinguishing between emotions, which are directed at a single object, and moods, which take an indeterminate plurality of objects. However, the proposal appears to me to fail on the issue of intelligibility. As we noted earlier, a major task for an account of intentionality is to help us make sense of the character of the relevant experience. By correlating the experience with its intentional target, the account should contribute to our understanding why the person is in the mood that he is. However, treating every different object in one's environment as the intentional object of mood may render inexplicable why one is in the particular mood that he is. Let me explicate this a bit. A mood is typically a state of long duration. It might last for hours, days, even longer. During that period, there is a large number of objects which come one's way, and which differ not only in their shape and size, but also in their evaluative profile. In a state of gloom, for instance, a person might happen to listen to a jolly tune. While it would be incorrect to think that just by listening to the tune, the person will snap out of his sad mood, it would also be wrong to claim that the person is unable to appreciate the life-affirmative character of that tune. However, decreeing that the jolly tune is the intentional object of the gloomy mood does not render the mood intelligible. Perhaps the combination of the gloomy mood and the jolliness of the tune creates in the listener a feeling of sympathy for the vain efforts of his fellow humans, or an irritation with his uncultured neighbors for their choice of music. The arising of those emotions might be explicable by the concurrence of the negative mood and the perception of the jolly tune. What is not plausible, though, is the explication of the particular mood by means of the representation of the tune as jolly. Given the wide variety of the evaluative profiles of the objects in one's environment, the postulated intentional correlation between mood and any object that happens to come one's way fails to discharge the task of rationalizing explanation. And so we come to the third and more recent proposal. Good. The third and most recent proposal attempts to articulate an account of the intentionality of moods, not by reference to some object, but what we're invited to think is that what is represented during a mood occurrence is a property. As such, in an anxious mood, it is threateningness. In an irritable mood, it is offensiveness. In a mood of contentment, it is delightfulness, and so on. The property represented by a mood is not attached to anything in particular. It is unbound. The proposal admits that moods appear to lack intentional object, but it claims that this lack does not deprive them of intentionality, since moods are states with a content which represents an unbound affective property. That approach appears promising since it sets a criterion for distinguishing emotions which are directed at an intentional object from moods which are not thus directed, while acknowledging that each mood has a different character because it involves a different mental content. However, in my opinion, the proposal is problematic on conceptual grounds. More precisely, it is an account of intentionality that combines three conceptual confusions. I think it combines three conceptual confusions, anyway, regarding the idea of an unbound affective property. Sorting out those confusions is a prerequisite for the sustainability of the account. The first confusion concerns the notion of ordinary object with intentional object. I may love my cat, which is a living entity, admire an espresso machine, which is an artifact, hate the change in the weather, an event, wish for world peace, a state of affairs, reflect about rectangularity, a property, wonder about the Ramsian restatement of Russell's paradox, a set of propositions, and so on. Simply put, an intentional object is whatever a mental state is about, or of, or directed at. But that at which the state is directed is not necessarily an object, if by that term one means a medium-sized, three-dimensional thing. The present representationalist proposal states that moods lack intentional object because they are about properties and not about objects, but that is obviously a problematic statement. Hence, the first problem for the representationalist is that from the alleged fact that moods are not about objects in the ordinary sense, she infers that they lack intentional object altogether.
You must be thinking about it.
Okay, yes, I have 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Too much?
At most.
At most, sorry. Okay, right. The second confusion, so I'll go through with the argument, concerns the notion of affective property and what we might call affect-related property. The representationalist employs the notion of affective property to pick up a property not of the affect, but of that which is related to and is represented by the affect. The problem is that this way of expressing herself quickly leads to the confusion of the representational state with that which gets represented. Thus, the theory begins with the claim that the mood is intentional due to its representation of affective properties, such as scariness, threateningness, offensiveness, and so on. And it concludes with a statement that in a mood we experience fear, joy, anxiety, but we don't experience anything as having these affective properties. The third confusion is of a different order, as it concerns a fundamental metaphysical issue. The representationalist claims that moods are intentional because they represent unbound properties. But what on earth is an unbound property? Unless the proponent becomes clear on this issue, her proposal is hard to understand and even harder to assess. I propose three interpretations of this notion of unbound property. First interpretation, unbound property is a property that is not bound to one particular substance. That is a claim easy to understand because it's trivial. No property is ever bound to one particular substance. Its property is in principle instantiable at more than one place at once, and that's why we often call objects particulars and properties universals. Second interpretation. Unbound is a property that is not instantiated. If that is the meaning of the notion of unbound property, then it is hard to comprehend how someone can be in a particular affective state that represents a non-instantiated property. Notice that the representationalist does not claim that someone is in a particular affective state because that state represents that a certain property is not instantiated. That would be the representation of a fact, not of a property. And our representationalist denies that this is the meaning he intends. Finally, a third interpretation might venture to focus not on what type of property an unbound property is, but on how we might think of it. Unbound is a property thought of not as instantiated by an object, but thought of merely as a property. Again, that claim offers little help in making sense of what is distinctive about the representational content of mood, or indeed of any affective state. Considering a property merely as a property appears to me to be a task for logical, conceptual, or metaphysical analysis. It is simply not clear why the representation of the properties of squareness or of scareness, of triangularity or of threadingness represented not as being instantiated, neither as owned by some object, nor as exemplified by some situation, but merely as properties should have any affective significance at all. Attending to the phenomena of mood raises a series of philosophical puzzles. It has been claimed that an appeal to the notion of intentionality could help us resolve those puzzles. In my discussion, I looked at some of those, perhaps the most popular suggestions, and found them problematic. But why bother about intentional relations to the world? I can think of at least two answers to that question. The first is that none of the currently prominent analysis of moods in the psychological literature proceeds without invoking some kind of intentional relation for moods. The other answer is that without some sort of correlation to one's situation, there is very little sense one can make of one's affective experiences. And without making sense of the experience, there is no prospect of assessing it. Hence, giving up completely on intentionality is hard for us because it deprives us of the possibility of doing something that strange animals that we are, we so much love to do. That is to fail that we are right, to fail just the way we do. Okay, cheers.